My name is Jonathan Jones, and I am a special education teacher. I work for St. Paul Schools. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Tonight we have Miss Janice Downing, who runs her own minority-owned business, which is called Common Sense Consulting. Janice has uh, about 29 years of experience with human resource professionals. She's worked across industry lines with companies large and small. She's conducted assessments that identify the root cause of problems and determines what needs to be done from the people and management's perspective. She has an education background. She went to Ohio State University School of Business. She is also trained in business process improvements and affirmative action planning methods. She also has a certification in human systems dynamics. She has several areas of expertise, a few of which include affirmative action, diversity and inclusion education and training services, diversity and inclusion recruiting and retention programs as well. She also was awarded the Minnesota Business Award from the Business Journal. So welcome, Ms. Downing. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Jen, and she's going to share a little bit of background information for everybody about what is Connect Ed and what is the racial equity community of practice.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I think, are you going to share your screen at this point? I'm not sure. I just can't see your screen, so I just want to make sure.
I apologize, everyone.
There we go.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry about
that. We're good. That's okay. So, hi, everybody. Welcome. I just want to thank Jonathan and Janice for Jonathan for organizing this event and Janice for joining us as a special guest. My name's Jen Cohan, and I am the Connected Communities Coordinator for Education Minnesota. So I help folks who want to get statewide groups moving. So you can reach out to me. I'll post my contact information. But I really want to take my hat off to Jonathan because we've had our Connected racial equity community of practice up for, going on maybe 5 months, 6 months. We're getting there. And this is our first webinar, and we're really excited, and Jonathan has just been a spectacular community moderator. So I'm always available for questions, later about how you can join the groups and even start your own groups. But we're just really, really thrilled to have Janice Downing joining us tonight with such a really important topic, and we've just gotten such great interest in this. So thanks, Jonathan, for putting this together.
Thank you. So as you can see, the agenda includes, I just want to go through a little bit of instructions for everybody, and I want to please make sure that you've muted your microphone, and you're going to utilize the chat feature in the bottom right-hand corner. If you have any questions, then you can type in your questions, and you'll send those questions directly to Jen, and then she'll chime in and share those questions with Janice as she's presenting this evening. Also, your engagement in tonight's webinar and signing up with our Racial Equity Community of Practice tonight, you'll be entered into an incentive raffle. And we have everything from gift cards that will be given out, and also we have our next webinar will be on The Myth of Race and Reality of Racism, which is a book by local author and Professor Mahmoud El-Khati. So we'll be giving out some of those as well for your participation in tonight's webinar. With that, if you have any questions, please use your chat feature, and Jen will be able to direct your questions as the presentation begins. With that, Janice, you have it.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. As Jonathan and Jen said, we're going to talk about neuroscience, and I'm really going to focus in on brain science and how that really impacts how we show up with individuals, and then what can we do about it so that we are not showing up in a way that is offensive when that's not our intention. And we'll talk about how the brain science, neuroscience, helps us understand why it happens and how often it happens, so that I don't bore you with a lot of research papers. What I've tried to do is talk in terms of content and topics. Jonathan asked me if I would share a list of resources, and I can do that after the fact. Or you can ask me about a specific topic, and I'll let you know if I can zero in on a specific resource that I used to share this information with you. So we're going to start, and Jonathan, can you go to the second slide? So I really want you to have an appreciation about the nature of and how often biases happen in the workplace and elsewhere. And then hopefully you'll have a better understanding about the relationship between unconscious bias, diversity, and inclusion. And then at the end of our time together, you'll have a understanding of how you can identify and address and reduce bias. And we'll talk about the roadmap, which really looks like a stoplight, and how I use that in my practice. So next slide. Stare at the window panes that are in front of you. Does it look like the lights are blinking, the dots that are blinking, or do they stay stationary? Jen, is anyone chatting?
I can say they look like they're blinking to me.
Yeah, I'm starting to see people say, yeah, they're blinking except for a few. They are not blinking at all on the screen. What's happening is your brain is shifting and it's filling in the dots, or it's trying to fill in the dots, because it sees the dark spaces and it sees the white spaces. And whenever our brain sees something that looks like it's incorrect, it tries to fill in that space. And so it starts making up its own words, its own thoughts. Does it automatically. Right? Does anyone see anything beyond the vase with flowers in it? Do you see anything else? Karen says there are two faces. Karen's right. So if you look at the vase and you look to the right of it, just where the flowers stop, you see somebody's forehead. And where there's a point, you'll see a nose. And below that, you might see two lips and a chin. And then you might see the beginning of a neck. And then there's another one. So there are faces in a silhouette. Kate, absolutely right. Can you go to the next? Yeah, thanks. So then you see this is a more extreme example of it. So there was a psychologist, and he basically did some research, and he said that sometimes people can only see the faces, sometimes they can see the vase, sometimes they can see both. What's happening is you're able to move back and forth in your brain. So you're able to move from left to right, so that you can see things like if you can see both of those images. So if you can see both images, can you let us know? Once again, you can use chat. Yeah, so people are seeing that. So I'm going to explain a little bit more around that. And I thought it'd be fun to do some exercises that could help you see things and shape them up in a different perspective. And so when I start talking about the neuroscience in your brain, what happens is people start thinking, well, that's not what I learned, or that's not how I learned it. And so I wanted you to stay open. So Jonathan, can you go to the next slide of the brain? Okay. So this picture is basically showing you different parts of the brain. So in the very center there, you'll see the amygdala. And sometimes people think about that as the base brain because it controls the thoughts that we have that are really basic. And when we're faced with situations that we don't like, that part of our brain gets triggered and it goes in, our bodies go into a fight or flight response. When we go into a fight or flight response, everything that we think from a rational standpoint really just shuts down. And our brain takes over because it wants to make sure that it has the ability to really focus our body's heart rate, our brain power, our blood flow, the protection of organs, all take higher priority, much higher priority than what would happen if we were thinking about a rational thought and trying to solve a problem, which happens in our prefrontal cortex. So people think about the prefrontal cortex as a place where we process higher thoughts, where we can have sound judgment and rational thinking. And then there's a middle section of our brain where we actually have to think about it's at a place where it's rational and we have some emotions, but we don't do our best thinking. But it'll allow us to pause. So one of the things that happens when we're in our amygdala is that if we're having a conversation with somebody that we don't like, our amygdala will shut the conversation down. Have you ever had an experience where you're talking with someone and after a while you realize you don't have any idea what the person has said? That's an amygdala response where your brain just says, I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to shut it off. And so if your brain feels like you're in a situation where it feels threatened or it feels fear, it will shut down that higher thinking response rate. And so one of the things that we have to caution ourselves on is we have to think of in terms of, are we feeling safe when we're at work or having a conversation? And if we're not, that amygdala gets triggered and we're not able to act rationally. And so a lot of times people will say, well, that's just the way this person is. The good news is that person can train their brain not to react or act in a certain way. We all can do that. And so it's really important for us to think in terms of where is our brain and what state is it in when we're in a situation. So I'm talking about a negative situation. I'll think about a positive situation. Think about your favorite friends that you like to hang out with. Maybe you aren't able to hang out with those people enough. Do you ever come away energized, excited? You might be feeling emotions like joy. You might feel pretty peaceful. That's because your prefrontal cortex has been activated and you're relaxed. And so when you are able to activate your prefrontal cortex and you're highly relaxed, that's where your best learning occurs. That's where your best work occurs. That's when you're able to think rationally. And for people like me, I think in terms of, why did I say I would do that? You know, you get asked to do a lot of different things. And sometimes I'm really good at saying no, and other times I'm not. What I realize if I'm really tired or I've had a really bad day and my brain is shut down, I'm not really thinking like I should, and sometimes I say yes when my amygdala is activated. When I can filter my thoughts and I really think about whether or not I've got the capacity to do something, or more importantly, do I want to do something, it's because my prefrontal cortex is activated and it's working. So I'm talking about the two extremes. I haven't really talked a whole lot about the middle of the brain, but I'll try to give some examples as I go on. I do want to talk about the fact that we have responses to things when our brains are triggered. And one of the things we have to think about is, how do we respond? Our first response, and Jonathan, can you go to the next slide? Our typical responses are usually physically. That's the first way that we'll respond to a trigger that happens with our brain. Our heart might beat faster. We might perspire. Our pupils will actually dilate. They'll become much smaller. Our muscles will tense, and we might have shallow or rapid heart breathing, depending on what the experience is. And then we'll usually move into one of these other states. So we might move into a state where we're actually thinking about things. So we have a mental shift. And we might move into ideas, or we might have some complex thought. We might have that, I should get out of here, or I should stay and fight it out. But at some point, the brain might shut down if it's in a situation where it doesn't feel safe. And people might even feel like they're being victimized or bullied. Or we might move into an active state. So we might have eye contact, but we might dip our eyes because we're really trying to protect ourselves and we're trying to go inside of ourselves. Or we might seek to be right. Or we might do some shaming or blaming. We might withdraw, or we become silent. We might become aggressive or angry. But we take some kind of action when we feel like we're being threatened. And the last area that we might experience is through relationships. So we might seek out others. We might ask people to take care of us, or we might look like a victim and we're looking for somebody who can act on our behalf, speak on our behalf, or mediate on our behalf. And so we have these responses to fear, and everyone has these types of responses. You might, in fact, have multiple responses. So I know that when I have a trigger, and it's a conflict or there's something that causes me fear, what happens is I have a physical reaction, and then I get withdrawn, and I might become more silent. And it's the way that I'd have to shift out of that is to reverse my pattern. So usually I have to take myself outside of the situation and take a walk. And then once I take a walk, I'm actually able to focus. And so I'm going to ask you to think about a situation that you've experienced that wasn't positive. Might have been with another individual or a group of people. And think about, how did you react in that situation? Was it a physical response, a mental response? Was it activity-based, or was it relationship-based? And it's really good to establish a pattern. So if you think about multiple situations like that, maybe 3 or 4, and you think, I have the same type of response every time, it's really good because you're starting to build in neural your neurons are actually activated when you are aware of these types of things. You can actually build what we call neuroplasty, which is you're trying to remap your brain. And you can't do that unless you know how you're actually responding to triggers. And so if you know, like I said, I usually have a physical reaction, and then I withdraw. I have some activity. The next thing you need to know is, when you've had a negative situation, my question would be, how have you gotten yourself out of it? So think about a situation where it wasn't going well, but you actually felt yourself shift out of that situation. What did you do to make that happen? Yes, Karen, you can type it in. That's fine. What kinds of things have you done to get yourself out of a situation? Did you listen to music? Did you read a book? Did you hang out with friends? Did you make a phone call? Yeah, we've got people making phone calls or listening to music or praying. Those are ways that we shift out. And so what happens is, if you know what happens to you physically, mentally, etc., when a trigger happens, and you know what's your list of go-tos when you have been triggered. Now, for me, in a really horrible situation, the best thing that I can do is to breathe. And the reason why I would share that with you is I have found that breathing actually opens up the airways within your body, which oxygenates your brain, which allows your amygdala to calm down. In a really bad situation, I've breathed and I've closed my eyes. Because sometimes you can't always just leave the situation. So ways to be able to come out of this situation and being clear about 2 or 3 pathways, and or giving yourself permission to leave the situation temporarily might be a good way to resolve that. So I'm going to show you a video now, and then we'll talk a little bit about biases and how your brain might be triggered by things that you see. Jonathan, can you show that video?
That's a really pretty drawing you got there. That's a really pretty drawing you got there. Hey, listen. I was just complimenting your drawing. I'm not a creep that's trying to get at you or anything. Girls these days, you think every guy is after you. You all have so much attitude, it's ridiculous.
Okay, Jonathan, you can stop. So the point the video makes is that the gentleman thinks that the woman is judging him. In fact, he is judging her. And what happens is that our brains formulate about 70,000 thoughts in a day. And our brain cannot process that many thoughts. So what it does is it filters thoughts. So I want you to think back to the first slide that I showed you with the dots that looked like they were blinking, but even though they weren't, our brain tries to fill in different things, and then it asks us to tell it when it's wrong. But we're not always aware of what our brains are thinking, and we're not aware of how our brains are processing those thoughts. And so many of you might have seen this model, the SEED model of bias by the Neuro Leadership Institute. And David Rock is one of the founders of the Neuro Leadership Institute. And he basically says that the way our brains filter is it looks for similarities. And it really tries to figure out, is that the same? Is it different? Do I like it? Do I not? Looks at expedience. How can I get somewhere the shortest possible manner, the easiest route? And when we're looking at that, we're surrounding ourselves or trying to experience things that are comfortable. Our brains don't like to get into messy or learning very deep. So conversations or that you have with friends that are they're very energizing are because you're shifting your brain very slowly when it's ready for engagement. And so in order for us to slow down the comparison of similarity or trying to get to the shortest route possible, we have to be in a pretty relaxed state. Our brains also look at what is our experience and what is happening, how close to a positive experience that we've had or how far away from a positive experience is this current situation. It looks at distance. It's like, you know, is this something that happened recently? Is this something that happened far in a long time ago? And most importantly, the brain will look at whether or not the situation makes us feel safe. And so being able to say, here's a situation. Is this something that I'm familiar with? Is it something that I'm unfamiliar with? Am I comfortable with it? Is it causing me to feel a threat? Is a way for us to slow the processing of our brains down. And so that's how you move from the amygdala thinking all the way up to the prefrontal cortex. You have to be able to process with simple questions like this model encourages us to use. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, thank you. So also by David Rock, there's the SCARF model. And so what happens is our brain starts to process through. What's the status? What's my status in this situation? How certain am I? How confident do I feel in the situation right now? Am I certain about what the outcome might be? Autonomy. Am I able to work independently? Is that something that I am feeling threatened by? Am I comforted by? Because our brains like to be independent. No, relatedness. How much do I understand? Am I comfortable with the thoughts that I'm having about this situation or that I'm experiencing with the person that is in front of me? And do I think that the situation is fair? When any of these feel threatened or they're negative, our brains think that they're negative, we shift into thinking in terms of bias thinking. And bias thinking is really around things that we're exposed to. And it's information that sends a warning signal to our brain. And whenever our brain starts to filter a thought and it just doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel fair, it can't relate to the situation at hand, it feels like it's being minimized, what happens is our brains start to process thoughts and it puts things into categories. It does this automatically. So people will ask me, are you biased? And I'm like, absolutely. Everyone is biased. So David, can you go to the next slide? Jonathan, thanks. And so it takes years of exposure for biases to happen. That's why little kids are so much fun to be around, because they don't have as many biases. And they don't have stereotypes that are hooked to the bias. So the difference between a bias and a stereotype is the bias is a thought that we've judged and categorized. And the stereotype is the label or the judgment that comes with that bias. For example, if you think in terms of, let's say, coffee drinkers and non-coffee drinkers, there might be a bias. So biases can be positive or they can be negative. But they're created because our brains, as I talked about before, those 70,000 thoughts are coming, and our brains are doing that mental shortcut, trying to fill in that gap. And we receive them through our life experiences or our work experiences. Sometimes they're cultural. Sometimes it's from the communities that we're involved in. Sometimes it's the friends that we're hanging around that help us process those thoughts in a certain way. So like I said before, yes, everyone has unconscious bias. And even then we say, I'm not going to act on that, I'm not going to think that way, we are doing it. And so we actually have to be intentional about what our thoughts are. And because our brains are wired to create biases, it's like a bias-making machine, we have to think about how do we shift them. It can be done gradually over time. Can you go to the next slide? So as I said, it's a positive or a negative mental attitude towards a person, a thing, or a group of people. And implicit bias is things that we actually are unaware of. It's an unconscious thought that rests in our minds our brains actually use. For example, when we're with individuals and we meet them for the first time, your brain has already decided about 4 to 5 seconds before you know what you're thinking, what it decided about the person that you're meeting for the first time. And then the thought cements itself. And the most interesting thing is you may or may not agree with the bias that your brain creates. So I'll be really transparent. I was at a stoplight earlier this summer, and a guy rolled up next to me on a Harley. And when he rolled up next to me, my brain started thinking all sorts of things. I'm like, his jacket is really interesting. It looks really expensive. It's hand-tooled leather. I can tell. It's well made. Oh, his boots look really expensive too. And so does his motorcycle. I wonder where he gets the money to pay for this. It's the middle of the day. Does he have a job? How is this working? And in the middle of these crazy thoughts, I realized, I don't know this guy. Why am I thinking these crazy thoughts? Why am I thinking so many biased thoughts about an individual? And so I literally had to shift my brain away from, it's not your business, I don't like it. And one psychologist uses the thinking when he's aware of it. He says, no, thank you. No, thank you to that thought. So it's one way that you have to become aware of the fact that you might be in bias land. An easy way to see whether or not you're doing that is if you go to a public space like the airport and you're sitting there for a while, do you make up stories about people that are walking by? Are they interesting stories? So playing the airplane game or the airport game, sometimes, the shopping game, you're looking in people's carts, wondering, I wonder why they're buying that. I wonder if they're having a dinner party. Those are things that you have to keep in mind. If you're doing that, you can kind of think about the trends. What are the thoughts that are circling in your mind? Are they okay? Are you okay with them? Are they creating bias? You can go to the next slide. So one of the reasons why this is really important is because some of the demographics are shifting so rapidly that people have said, well, it's okay. There isn't that much change. We really don't have to worry about it, but that's not true anymore. So by 2025, the world's going to shift from 6.8 billion to 8 billion people. And the population in India is going to represent 1/5 of all of the growth. And individuals from China, India, and other parts of Asia are going to come here to the United States to become educated. And many of those individuals who become educated will actually stay to work either temporarily or long term. Next slide. And in Minnesota, the demographics continue to change. So back in 1985, the state demographics for people of color were below 10%. And now it's about 19%. And the race demographics are going to continue to grow over time. And it's really important that we think about that shift, because race is a thing that our brains register first. And a lot of times when it registers race, it's inaccurate. So if we were to ask people, what nationality are you? Some people know, some people don't. But a lot of times our information of what we see is inaccurate. What's most important to think about is we don't often have the opportunity to check out the data that our brains are registering. So if you look at the age demographics, can you go to the next slide, Jonathan? One of the things that's really interesting to me, if you look at Dakota County and Hennepin County, these are the age demographics, and I know it's really hard to see the age count, But what's really interesting to me is they all about look the same. It doesn't matter what age group we're talking about. And in some cases, the age groups are going to shift down, but they're pretty steady across the board. And this is over time. So we're moving from 2015 to like 2045. And so one of the things that we need to think about is we've been told that people who are old, so to speak, those are 70 years of age, should be retiring. And you'll see that that demographic, which is at the very top of the scale, isn't necessarily going to retire in the time frame that we thought before. And so there will be more people from different generations working in the workplace, which means more discomfort for people. And so we really have to think about if we're uncomfortable with generations or race or ethnicities, and these are the ones that I hear most often in my practice, how are we going to get to thinking styles, communication styles, the work style? Those are the three that we really need to be thinking about, because those will cut across all generations, all races. Maybe the approach might be different, but many people from different generations have the same work style or work ethic, even though people will say or pick on some type of generation. For example, I often hear people pick on millennials, and I'm like, they work differently, but many of the biases that I'm hearing don't necessarily play out if you ask people about how the work gets done, when it gets done. It's different. For example, millennials will work, some millennials will work really late in the night. They will work early in the morning, they'll work on their weekends. They may not work the traditional 8 to 5. So it's different, and that's not always accounted for or allowed. And then sometimes it's not supported. Next slide. So it's really important that we think in terms of emotional intelligence, because our brains really like to be on the right-hand side of itself. The left-hand side likes to work with data and results. The right-hand side likes to be innovative, and it likes ideas. And so when we're able to think in terms of right-hand side, that also will allow us to shift forward in our brains and have us engage in a part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex. And so I'm going to use some information on emotional intelligence. So that's what EQI is. And it's a set of social skills that allow us to influence how we interact with people, the relationships that we form, how we take social cues, how we give social cues, how we cope with challenges like conflict management, and how we use emotional information in a way that works for us and with others. So, Jonathan, can you play that next video? And it'll explain more.
Since the dawn of humanity, the understanding of well-being and rational decision-making has remained relatively unchanged. However, recent discoveries in neuroscience and psychology may fundamentally change long-held theories about emotion and reasoning. One recent study analyzed patients who had experienced damage to the amygdala, a primitive part of the brain that typically regulates emotions. What they discovered was that these patients had often lost their ability to feel emotions and make basic decisions. The implication of this discovery is that our decisions are not determined simply by logic or emotions alone, but rather a combination of the two. When we make a bad decision that affects our well-being, it is typically caused by an imbalance between our reasoning and our emotions. This process of understanding and facilitating emotions into rational thinking is known as emotional intelligence. Originally developed in 1990 by John Mayer, David Caruso, and Peter Salovey, the theory of emotional intelligence can be broken down into 4 simple aspects. 1. The ability to perceive emotion. For humans, cues like facial expressions and gestures can indicate complex emotions that influence our understanding of other people, such as happiness, sadness, anger, and fear. 2. Understanding emotions. Emotions convey information. For example, happiness usually indicates a desire to join with other people. Sadness indicates a desire to avoid people, and so on. Each emotion conveys its own patterns of possible messages and actions associated with those messages. 3. Using emotions to facilitate thought. In recent years, cognitive scientists have discovered that emotions prioritize our thinking. Therefore, having a good system of emotional input can help you focus on things that truly matter. 4. Managing emotions. Managing emotions involves the ability to promote certain types of behavior through emotions and using them to your advantage. For example, if you're sad, you're more likely to be reflective and analytical. If you are happy, you're more likely to be social and outgoing. These 4 aspects that make up emotional intelligence inform our decisions, help predict life outcomes, and help us understand people in order to build healthy relationships.
Okay, so actually, Jonathan, can you go back a couple of slides? Because I was reading comments while you guys were watching the video, which is awesome. Keep So when we're talking about the age demographic, I was making the point about it's really important not to necessarily just put people into groups, because my experience has been that work style, communication style, conflict management style will cut across all types of age demographics. I'm going to also say,
Excuse me, Janice. It's kind of hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I was saying that some of the chat was around. It's refreshing to know that it's dangerous to categorize people into generations and assume that, for example, millennials. I was using the example. People pick on millennials and they say they don't have the same work ethic, and I'm like, I found that there's some really incredibly hardworking millennials, and that's not a small number. There are a large number of millennials that I know that are incredibly good at what they do. Likewise, there are some people who are baby boomers and they're incredibly lazy, and people don't talk about that. And there are more baby boomers than there are millennials. And now it's starting to, like, there are more nexters and millennials than there are baby boomers. And so it's really, I want to cement the point of people that are making on chat that it's really not good to judge others because of their age. It's not good to judge them based on their culture. And I'm bringing this up because it's a bias. When I ask people, so what facts do you have that you're making this decision on? It's like, well, I had this experience with, and then they have a name that they fill into this blank line that I give them. And it's like, well, that's fine. Even if you have an experience with 2 or 3, does that mean the next person that is like that is going to be exactly like you've had in your experience to date? We don't know. Every person is unique and different. So I really love the fact that people are putting those points out in the chat, and I find them really profound and really good. And there was one more, so hold for me while I just go back, because it was a really good point. So we had someone say, I think the key is to be honest and name the bias and to be mindful of it and aware of how it can impact your actions or how you treat others. And this is the key. So many times we get so upset with ourselves that we are acting out on a bias, but it's actually refreshing to others when we actually just name it. and say, I know I'm treating you in such a way, and it's not right, and apologize for it. And it gives people permission to be authentic and transparent. So I'd encourage you to be able to do that. So, okay, can you go forward now? Thank you. So one of the things that helps figure out how we land is in terms of how do we manage stress. And I talked about that a little bit before when I was talking about how your brain does the shift from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. And knowing how do you make decisions, how flexible are you when you're feeling stressed out? Or how optimistic are you? What's your ability to manage stress? Do you have a high threshold or you have a very low threshold? Knowing how you manage stress will help you a lot. And so I actually suggest that people learn how to meditate. And some people will say, well, that just feels really weird to me and I'm not comfortable. But when you have the ability to manage your mind by thinking about how you're thinking, when you're going to have a thought, slowing your thoughts down, it makes an incredible difference. So I think so one of the things that we can think about in terms of work is that we have to be really intentional about how we show up. And so this EQI model, emotional intelligence model, basically puts it in categories that I think are pretty easy to think about. It's like, how do I think I'm coming across to people? That's that self-perception. How am I expressing my thoughts and feelings to others? Am I relating to people in a way that builds relationship or does it erode relationship? That's that interpersonal piece. And then I talked about decision making and stress management. And so when you're able to be intentional in all 5 of those areas, and you can ask yourself questions about what cues am I seeing in the conversations that I'm having with people? Are people just nodding their heads or are they actually engaging with me? When I'm asking people to have a conversation, are they open to that or do they seem to be putting me off? Those are some cues that'll help you figure out whether or not there's some work that you need to be doing. So I talked about the model in terms of shift. So I mentioned it is a red, yellow, green model. And so if I feel like I am physically in the right place, when I feel like emotionally I feel centered and am able to manage all that I have to do, when I feel like I'm actually making a contribution and the right things are happening, that would be a green state. Now I'm going to jump to red for a minute. When I feel like I'm not at my best, I'm not engaging in a way that really makes sense or makes me feel confident, I feel unsettled, I feel fearful, or I'm feeling some anxiety, that would be red. And when I'm in a yellow state, I feel uncertain and I'm just not feeling confident. What we have to do is think about where are we and then what causes that shift. So before I asked, and I love this, I said, how do you shift when you've had a bad situation? And somebody said ice cream. I totally get it, because before we had this webinar, I actually said I need some comfort food, and I warmed up a bowl of beans and rice. And it was just really comforting to be able to sit, relax, and drink a cup of tea before we started. And that was a way for me to re-engage, because I was really exhausted before we started this. But the comments that I'm seeing online have really started to energize me. And so it's been good to be able to spend time with you to talk through some of this. And once again, I'm working very hard not to say, here's a research site, here's a paper you could read, because I think these practical versions of the models are better. So I think, David, Jonathan, did I leave enough time for questions?
Yes. You have.
Okay.
You have.
So I will take questions, and I promise that I will absolutely send some research link sites for Jonathan to load up in the website.
Did you want me to share that last video?
We'll show it in a minute. I just want to give people time to ask questions first.
Okay.
Because I know we could get short on time.
Yep. And we can always, like you said, your takeaways that you wanted to share, we can always
yep.
We can post all those.
Yep, that would be great. Okay. Somebody posted about Nebraska culture versus Minnesota culture. You know, I've only been to Nebraska a few times, and so I can't talk intelligently about the culture because I think what I saw was in a limited space. Like I was doing a couple of training sessions in a hotel, so I don't really think that is representative of Nebraska culture. But I will say that the cultural norms that are around you will really predict how you interact with others. And I think that one of the things that having an honest, transparent conversation is not typical in most American cultures, unless you're on the East Coast. And in that way, it might be a little too intense for some people. Or you might be on the West Coast, and that is it is heralded to be open and transparent. But the pace of the conversation may not be as deep as others might like it. And when I say deep, I don't mean in terms of philosophical, I mean in terms of surface. You know, is it a surface conversation, or is it something that we're sharing our thoughts and feelings about? There are two questions. I'm going to kind of combine them. They're asking, are the differences based upon age? I think that what I've seen is that people are open and honest with this kind. Sorry?
Yeah, you went out on us, so you're a little hard to hear for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think that people are open and honest when what I found is that the nexters are extremely open and honest about wanting to have conversations about lots of things that cause learning. I think that people who are later generation baby boomers are incredibly open and honest because they've gotten so much wisdom, and they're at that point in their lives they don't care as much what people think, and so they're willing to share openly and honestly. So from an age standpoint, and I'm categorizing, and I really don't like that because not everybody in those categories I'm talking about act like that. But as a trend, that's what I would see. And then in terms of, students and adults, I think what can get in the way is we usually communicate to people in a way that is comfortable for us, and we don't think about what do people need us to do so that we communicate effectively for them. For example, sometimes I talk too fast for people, and sometimes I have to slow it down. Or if I'm working with someone who is introverted, I need to give them time to process things, not necessarily shoot them with a lot of different information over a really short period of time. That can be really frustrating. So a lot of times, and you're much more experts than I am about teaching, but finding multiple ways to teach individuals works better than using the typical standard approach. So 3 or 4 different ways to come at a topic is usually more preferred. And then think. Somebody asked a really, really good question. It's pretty deep. I'm going to see if I can summarize this. How can I teach, from a multicultural way versus just through my lens? And so the best ways that I can say that is to be able to think in terms of how can you bring in different perspectives into the classroom. So for my girls, when they were really little, I would make sure that I bought them books that reflected different cultures. We went to different restaurants and ate. And I wanted them to learn the differences from different cultures. Like we ate at Japanese restaurants, Thai restaurants, Vietnamese, Chinese restaurants, Korean restaurants, because I wanted them to know that Asian was a group that people put a label on, but that didn't really make sense because those populations of those different individual cultures were so big and it's rich to experience. And so, and I'm using Asian because, I mean, I could say, Hispanic, I could say African, and it would be the same approach. It's that we lump a big group together because our brains are lazy, basically. They don't want to think about, the multiple cultures that might be on a continent like Africa or Asia, and what are all of the different ethnicities that come into play with that. So it could be through video, it could be through books, it might be magazines. But the other thing that I did was I literally found the books, and if the characters were all Caucasian, I would colorize them so that the kids look like they were from the United Nations. And so, I mean, this was an ESL teacher, and I think it's just good to be able to represent things. One other piece, since the ESL prompts in my head, is that a lot of times we will ask kids to think in terms of their, to answer questions, but we don't ask them to think about it in the language that is their home language or their base language. So if a child really knows French first or Russian first or whatever, we ask kids to do assignments in English. Well, they can write it in English if they think it out in their home language of Russian and then write the paper in English. But it's hard for people who have 2 or 3 languages that they know to translate emotion. If they've learned their emotions in one language, they literally have to translate from their right brain to their left brain and back to their right brain again. It's exhausting. So having people think in their own language and then write in English would be a lot easier for them. Here's a comment, and this is a great way to land. I also think that you have to allow students to bring part of themselves to the classroom. They shouldn't have to leave their personal selves at the door. That's a lovely, lovely thought. That's exactly what I was trying to say with that long-winded example. So I think we're at time. And so, Jonathan, I think it would be great if you go ahead and play us out with that last video.
All right.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TV Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong. But it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
That made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
And while I know that you, as educators, aren't really thinking about Google as a business, I think it's really important that you understand that that's the world that you're training your students into, that there are still a number of biases, and the work that you do is really, really important. And so the fact that you would take an hour and a half or more out of your time so that you could learn about this, so that you would be a better resource, I'm going to say even better resource for your students, is amazing. So I thank you for your time. Thank you for your participation, and I wish you well.
Thank you, Janice. All right, so what we're going to be doing next now is a couple things. I'm going to leave the instructions on the page and zoom out of the presentation mode. And I'd like everybody who is online to actually go into our community online, which is, you're going to go to this website. And I'll actually go back to presentation real quick. I want you to type in www.mynea360.org, and I'd like you to create an account. And then once you have created an account for yourself, you're going to search for Racial Equity Community of Practice. That's the community of practice that I provide a variety of resources related to equity in the field of education. And also the other primary purpose of the community is to connect educators from across the country who are concerned about this and also have resources that they would like to share. So on there, I'll give everybody a few minutes to do that. I will show you, while people are doing that, I will show everybody what it actually looks like. So you'll come to a page, and let me actually sign out. Once you put in your my NEA 360, you'll get a page like this, and you're gonna sign up, and then you'll log into the site. When you log in, it will bring you to the welcome page, and up here you have several tabs. And you'll go up here in the search and look for Racial Equity Community of Practice. And then it will be, you can ask to join the group, and it will be on this page. And actually, if you click on groups, you may see the most recent, you'll see Racial Equity Community of Practice. You may be able to join that way as well. Click on the link here. And as you can see myself, this is me right here. I'm Jonathan. And Jen have posted a couple things in regards to tonight's presentation. And we will be posting the slides. And also when the video is ready, we will also be sharing the webinar as well. And also, this is where you will find who is the raffle winners for tonight's webinar. Again, we'll be raffling off some gift cards and also a book by local professor Mahmoud Al-Kati. He's written a book called Myth of Race and the Reality of Racism. And we'll be giving a few of those books away as well. That will actually be our next webinar, and that webinar will take place, and I believe there's a typo that'll be, it's not the first, it'll be November 27th, and you'll be able to go online and register for that. You can see over here on the side, it lists that information. It'll be in the evening again from 6:30 to 8 p.m. I'm going to open it up. Does anybody have any questions? I kind of ran through that kind of fast. And Jen, why don't we unmute everybody and people can just chime in if they'd like.
Great. Let's see here. There we go. Folks who are muted who don't want to unmute themselves, I don't have control over that. But if you have any questions, feel free to speak up. I can just say briefly, this is one of many groups. So sometimes I have folks say, ask a question like, oh, is this kind of somewhere else I've got to log into? But the really nice thing about this platform, the NEA360.org platform, is that you can find lots and lots of groups to suit your interests. In fact, Jonathan, I'd say that I'm noticing more and more crossover where, like, you and I are connected to another group, maybe the School to Prison Pipeline group, and then now those folks are joining this group. So it's been a really nice way for folks, to network. It's not just Minnesota, it's nationwide, but we do have about 6 to 8 statewide groups up and running now, and this one I think has the most number of members at 85 folks in this group. And then the other thing I would say is that we will be posting Janice's slides and resources, but this is also a place where you guys can share resources with one another and ask questions, and if you're having any kinds of issues or you're looking for a resource, to post a question and somebody should be able to get back to you.
And the other piece too with this, the online forum, is the forum itself is designed to the community members will decide. If community members are saying, like, for example, if you look here on the page here, I have listed the webinars so far that we're going to have, and below that I have potential webinars. If any members have suggestions or know of additional experts as far as it relates to equity within the field of education, please share that with us. because we can always determine as a group what are some of the webinars that we want to do, or some of the different activities that our community wants to participate in. I will not be dictating what the group does. The group will decide together what kind of direction we want to take it as we move forward.
Karen, that is a really good question about
Great question.
I don't really see why not. We're actually moving into a whole new phase of online professional development here at Education Minnesota, so I'm going to circle back on that. I don't see why not. I just don't think we've ever done it before because this is our first webinar. So yeah, let me I will look into that. I think that's probably, I feel 99% sure that we can make that happen, and I think I have, as long as everybody registered on the form that Jonathan originally sent out, and that's how you got your link, then I should have your email. And for those folks who showed up to the webinar, then I think I should be able to send you out some CEUs. That's a great question.
Yes, it is. Any other questions?
Okay.
Well, one last bit of instructions for everybody. Once you have joined the community, I'd like you to do a couple things. Once you have your profile, or you're actually logged in, I'd like you to go to your profile, and I'll kind of walk you through this here. I'd like for you to set up your actual individual profile. Put a picture up there because it's nice to know who you're talking to, and then also give us some information if you want to include your contact information here. And then over where it says overview, you're going to give us a brief description about yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your interests, so that we can get you connected with other individuals like yourselves. And I think that is it.
You know, Jonathan, I just thought of one more thing. If you can go back to the group page, underneath the profile picture on the group page, there is a little drop down, or sorry, when you click on the Racial Equity Community of Practice group.
Yeah.
Yep, and then underneath that picture it says email every post. You can set, it's going to default to a weekly notice for you guys when you sign up, but I always recommend folks just set it to email every post so that you're reminded to check for a while until it becomes kind of regular, and you can always scale it back. But like as an example, I always say I'm part of like 30 different groups, and I've got all of my groups set to email every post, and I never feel overwhelmed. So it's just a recommendation so that you're reminded to use this as a resource and use each other as a resource. That's really the whole goal, is that this is all driven by educators. So that's all I have to say, and I just want to thank everybody again.
And thank you, everybody. With that, I think we will close out a little bit early. And again, this will be posted on the webinar so you can have access to the video at a later date. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.